Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to tackle something uh, pretty big.
Yeah,
I mean, a topic that's, well, it's as old as civilization itself, but it's always changing, right?
right.
Money. We're talking about money,
Yeah.
but not just any money. We're going deep into the world of fiat money.
Okay.
And, we'll see how it all compares to the rise of Bitcoin.
Sounds good.
Okay, so imagine this. It's 1915, World War I is raging, and all these nations, they're just scrambling for financial stability.
Yeah.
And they make this huge decision to abandon the gold standard.
Big change.
It really was. So in this deep dive, we're going to kind of trace that historical thread. You know, how we got to the fiat system we have today.
Yeah.
And then, after that, we'll look at Bitcoin and how it could impact everything.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to use the work of Saifedean and Ammous to guide us.
Yeah.
Specifically, his books, The Fiat Standard and The Bitcoin Standard.
I mean, those are pretty thought-provoking. They really make you rethink how we view money.
Yeah, for sure. So this shift from gold to fiat, it wasn't like an overnight thing, right?
No, not at all. It was a gradual process, a series of reactions to all these pressures, political and economic. That happened over decades, really.
So to really understand fiat, we need to start with the gold standard, I guess. Most people have heard of it, but it's kind of a mystery, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So under the gold standard, countries linked their currencies to, well, a specific amount of gold. And that provided stability, right?
Yeah.
And it limited how much governments could just print money whenever they felt like it.
Ah, that makes sense. So then why did we move away from it? I mean, it sounds pretty good.
Yeah, well, it wasn't perfect, of course. Countries, they wanted more flexibility, especially during wartime or economic hardship.
Okay.
So they started using this, well, it was called the gold exchange standard. Basically, they could hold reserves in other countries' currencies, mainly British pounds, which were, of course, backed by gold.
Oh, so it's like a hybrid system. Gold, but with some wiggle room, I guess?
Exactly. But this also made things more complex, and honestly, it created a potential for abuse.
How so?
Well, take Britain, for example. They could print more pounds than their gold reserves actually allowed.
Dang.
Yeah. And that essentially exported inflation to other countries.
So it sounds like that was a pretty unstable setup.
It was, yeah. And this vulnerability, combined with, well, all the economic troubles of the early 20th century, it eventually led to the gold standard's collapse.
Gotcha. And then in 1971, Nixon closed the gold window, and the dollar became the world's reserve currency.
Right.
But it wasn't backed by gold anymore. That was a huge turning point.
Absolutely, yeah. That decision, I mean, it really severed the last link between money and a tangible asset like gold. And that's how we entered the era of fiat money. And it wasn't planned, it was a reaction to all these economic pressures at the time.
So instead of money being something real, we moved to a world where, well, what is fiat money exactly if it's not tied to something physical?
Think of fiat money as a technology. It's like software, but instead of code, it operates through a system of credit and debt. So new fiat tokens are created through lending and then destroyed when debts are repaid.
Okay. I think I'm starting to get it, but it is a different way to think about money. Can we use a real-world example to kind of illustrate it, like getting a mortgage?
Sure, let's say you walk into a bank, you want a mortgage for your, dream house. The money the bank lends you, it's not just sitting in a vault somewhere waiting for you.
Yeah. Where does it come from then?
The bank actually creates new fiat tokens when they give you the mortgage. They have a lending license. It's how fiat money enters the economy.
So the money doesn't exist until the bank decides it does. That's something else. And who gets to decide how much of this magic money gets created?
That's where central banks come in. They're really I guess you could say, the puppet masters of the system.
Yeah.
They control the supply of the national currency. They regulate domestic banks. They clear international payments. And they even lend money to governments.
It's a lot of power in one place. And this fractional reserve banking system, where banks only keep a fraction of their deposits in reserve, doesn't that seem a bit risky?
It does, yeah. Because they're only holding a small percentage, banks are basically creating money by lending out more than they actually have. And this can lead to a cycle of credit expansion, these artificial booms, and then inevitably busts.
It's like building a house of cards. You keep adding more, but one wrong move, and the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. And when things start to get shaky, central banks often have to step in as the lender of last resort. They inject liquidity into the system to prevent a total collapse.
But doesn't that create a moral hazard? If banks know they'll get bailed out, Aren't they more likely to take bigger risks? I mean, they know they won't face the consequences if things go wrong.
That's the issue. This constant intervention, called reflation, it keeps the boom and bust cycle going. Central banks are often under a lot of political pressure to keep things going, even if it just delays the inevitable consequences.
So we've gone from money that was backed by gold to this system where money is created out of thin air,
Yeah.
and it's all controlled by central banks. What does this mean for the average person living in this fiat world? What are the costs, really?
A lot of the costs are hidden, but they're huge. Fiat money really impacts our time preference, our view of the future, even the very fabric of society.
Time preference. What does that even mean? How does fiat money distort how we see time and value?
Well, because fiat money tends to lose value over time because of inflation, it encourages people to consume now instead of saving for the future. I mean, why would you hold on to something that's always losing value?
Yeah, so it's like the money's burning a hole in your pocket. It makes you spend it now rather than save it for later.
Right. And this short-term thinking, it's everywhere. From our personal finances to the way we design buildings, manage environmental resources, plan for the future.
That makes sense. And speaking of things that are constantly losing value, let's talk about food. In his book, Saifedean Ammous has this really interesting section on what he calls fiat food. It shows how fiat money impacts our everyday lives.
Absolutely. Ammous argues that this fiat system, along with government policies, it's completely reshaped our food system, and not in a good way. It's hurting our health and well-being. Think about those huge agricultural subsidies that favor industrial farming over smaller, sustainable farms.
So instead of having a diverse food system, we end up focused on mass-produced processed food. It's cheaper, but is it really better for us?
It's a good question. And government dietary guidelines, which are often influenced by lobbyists, have made it worse. Like the focus on low-fat diets. That led to healthy fats being demonized. And then all these processed foods loaded with sugar and carbs, those became more common.
It's kind of crazy to think that the type of money we use impacts what we eat.
It really does. It's a perfect example of how finance, which seems abstract, has real consequences for everyday life. And it doesn't stop at food. Ammous also talks about fiat education and fiat science. He says the fiat system distorts priorities in those areas, too.
Fiat education and fiat science. I definitely want to hear more about that.
Let's dive into those ideas next. So we were talking about how fiat money affects things like food, but Ammous also brings up these ideas of fiat education and fiat science.
Yeah, those concepts really got me thinking. Like, what did he actually mean by that?
Well, he's saying that this fiat system, with its focus on the short term and all that centralized control, it's messed up the incentives and priorities in education and research.
Okay, so let's unpack that, starting with education. What's fiat education all about?
Think about the cost of college. It's insane these days. Easy access to student loans, which is fueled by, you guessed it, fiat money creation, has pushed tuition costs through the roof, and it leaves all these graduates with mountains of debt.
It's a vicious cycle. Students need loans to afford school, and colleges raise tuition because students can get loans, and the whole system is kind of broken.
Right. And all that debt, it influences what students study. They feel pressured to pick majors that lead to those high-paying jobs, even if they don't love it or, even if it's not really what they're passionate about.
So instead of learning for the sake of learning, they're chasing a paycheck to pay off these loans. It's a bit depressing, isn't it?
It is, and this fiat mindset, it creeps into academia too. Professors get rewarded for publishing research, even if it's not very relevant or useful.
It's that publish or perish game. Quantity over quality, right?
Exactly. But how does this tie into fiat science?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Well, think about how scientific research gets funded. It has a huge impact on what gets studied. Government grants, which are often influenced by political agendas, those decide which research gets funded.
So you're saying that research might be skewed toward areas that align with what the government wants?
Yeah.
Not necessarily what would benefit society as a whole?
That's the concern. And it can lead to research findings being, well, manipulated or even suppressed if they don't fit the narrative,
It's like he who pays the piper calls the tune. So how can we even know if the science we're being told is true?
That's the big question. We need to be much more critical when we evaluate scientific claims. Look beyond the headlines, really dig into the methods, the funding sources, any potential biases.
Be an informed consumer of information, not just accepting everything at face value. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about the downsides of fiat. Now let's switch gears and talk about Bitcoin. How is it different? Does it offer a solution to some of these fiat problems?
Bitcoin is different from fiat in a few really important ways. First, it's decentralized, no central authority controlling it. Second, its supply is fixed. It's predictable, determined by an algorithm that everyone can see. And third, it's secured by a global network of computers, not by any government or institution.
So it's like the Wild West of money. No sheriff, no central bank, just people interacting directly.
That's a good analogy. And it's this decentralization that makes it so revolutionary. It challenges that whole idea that money needs to be controlled by governments or central banks.
But if there's no one in charge, how can we be sure it's secure? I mean, what's stopping someone from just hacking the system and stealing everyone's Bitcoin?
That's where cryptography comes in, and the idea of proof of work. Bitcoin transactions are recorded on a public ledger. It's called the blockchain, and it's spread across thousands of computers around the world.
So it's like this massive shared spreadsheet that everyone can see.
Exactly. And to add new transactions to this blockchain, computers called miners have to solve complex math problems. This process, proof of work, it takes a ton of computing power and energy.
Which brings us to the big criticism of Bitcoin, right? The energy consumption.
Yeah.
How can we justify using so much energy just for money?
It's true that Bitcoin mining uses a lot of energy, but it's important to understand why. It's what secures the network. It makes it extremely hard and very expensive for anyone to tamper with transactions or double spend Bitcoin.
So it's a trade-off. High energy use, but in return, you get a super secure system.
Right. And actually, Bitcoin mining is pushing innovation in renewable energy. As Bitcoin gets more valuable, miners are looking for cheaper and more sustainable energy sources, things like hydroelectricity and geothermal.
So it could actually be a force for cleaner energy. That's a pretty interesting thought. But can Bitcoin actually scale? I mean, can it handle all the transactions needed for a global system? Like credit card companies process thousands of transactions every second. Can Bitcoin keep up?
Yeah, that's a valid question. The Bitcoin community is definitely working on this. On-chain transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain, they do have limitations when it comes to speed and cost, but there are solutions being developed.
What kinds of solutions?
One that's showing a lot of promise is the Lightning Network. It's a system of payment channels that operate off-chain, which allows for almost instant and very cheap transactions. Think of it like a network of payment highways built on top of the Bitcoin blockchain.
So it's not about replacing the Bitcoin blockchain. It's more about making it more efficient for daily transactions.
Exactly. The Lightning Network can handle millions of transactions per second. It's more than enough for even the most demanding situations.
That's impressive. Okay, so what about governments? What's stopping them from just banning Bitcoin? Could they stop it from growing?
A lot of people ask that. But banning Bitcoin is really difficult because it's decentralized. There's no central point of control for governments to target.
It's not like shutting down a company or a bank.
Right. And as more people use Bitcoin and understand its value, the less likely governments are to try and ban it. They might try to regulate it, though, or maybe even co-opt the technology for themselves.
Speaking of co-opting technology, you mentioned earlier that governments might launch their own digital currencies, those CBDCs. Are they a threat to Bitcoin? Could they combine the convenience of digital currency with the stability of government-backed money?
It's something to keep an eye on. CBDCs could streamline payments and reduce costs, but there are risks. The big one is that they would still be controlled by central banks. So, still subject to political whims and potentially the same inflationary pressures as regular fiat currencies.
So we'd be trading one form of centralized control for another.
Basically. And while they might offer some benefits, they don't solve the fundamental problems with fiat. The potential for abuse, the lack of transparency, and the erosion of individual financial control.
It sounds like we're heading for a showdown, Decentralized versus centralized, individual control versus government control.
It's the future of money, and it's happening right now.
All right, well, on that note, let's keep digging into this clash of systems and explore what all this means for the future. So you've been talking about these CBDCs, these central bank digital currencies. Could they actually be a threat to Bitcoin? What if they really take off?
It's possible, but I think, you got to remember that Bitcoin and CBDCs, they're just totally different things. Bitcoin's decentralized, it's transparent, and nobody can censor it. CBDCs, though, they'd still be run by central banks, subject to politics, and probably just as vulnerable to inflation as regular fiat currency.
So even if CBDCs become a big deal, Bitcoin still has its own unique place.
Right. It gives you something CBDCs can't. True financial sovereignty. You control your own money. No government interference.
That's a pretty powerful idea. But it's not all about the tech, is it? There's also the psychology of it all. Trust. People have to believe this decentralized system works, that their Bitcoin is safe, that it'll hold its value.
Trust is, well, it's crucial for any money to work. Bitcoin's no different. But the trust is different. You're not trusting some government or central bank. You're trusting the tech itself, the cryptography, the math that makes Bitcoin secure.
It's like trusting the laws of physics instead of trusting some institution that could mess things up.
Yeah, exactly. And that change in who you trust, it can be really empowering. It takes the power of money away from a small group and gives it back to individuals.
And that brings us to the social impact. We talked about financial inclusion, but it's bigger than that, right?
Yeah.
Bitcoin could level the playing field. Everyone gets access to the same financial tools, no matter where they live or their economic status.
Totally. Bitcoin doesn't care about borders or traditional financial systems. It can help people in developing countries who don't have access to banks. They can join the global economy, send money, build a better life for themselves and their families.
It's a lifeline for those who've been shut out of the system.
Exactly. And that potential to do good, it's a big reason why Bitcoin is becoming so popular.
But it goes beyond economics, too. It's about culture, isn't it? Bitcoin challenges those old ideas about money, power, control.
It's a cultural revolution, a total shift in how we view the world. It makes you question the role of government, what trust really means, even the definition of money itself.
Like it's holding up a mirror, making us rethink everything we thought we knew.
Right. Bitcoin asks us to imagine a world where individuals have more control, where power is more balanced, where innovation can thrive.
So as we wrap this up, let's step back for a second. What kind of world does Bitcoin point to? What happens in the long run if this tech really takes hold?
Well, nobody knows for sure. But we can imagine a world where Bitcoin gives power to individuals, where it fuels innovation and creates more economic freedom and opportunity.
A world with transparent financial systems that everyone can access and hold accountable.
A world where people can shape their own destinies, free from those old institutions and all that centralized control.
It's a bold vision.
Yeah.
But it feels like it's worth fighting for.
It is. And it's getting more real every day as Bitcoin grows and evolves.
Well, that's a great note to end on. We've come to the end of our deep dive into fiat and Bitcoin. Thanks to everyone for listening and joining us on this journey. We've covered a lot: history, economics, technology, even a little philosophy.
It's been great, and I hope the conversation keeps going.
We've just scratched the surface, really. The story of money. It's still being written. The future is unfolding right in front of us.
We all have a chance to shape it.
So keep exploring, keep learning, keep asking questions. The world of money's changing. And it's up to us to decide what that change looks like.
Thanks for listening.